Hey Brian, how are you?
Good. How are you doing, sir?
I'm well, thanks. Enjoying the continuation of spring in Philadelphia and been getting outside a lot. Not in nature so much, but outside at least.
Uh-huh.
So that's good.
Nice.
Yeah.
Yeah, today we're having a blustery day. It may even rain. You might hear the wind blowing stuff around outside. We'll see.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
But a little on the chilly side.
Yeah. Yes. I guess it's a little late for that, isn't it, in New Mexico?
Well, we just passed our final frost date.
Uh-huh.
So it shouldn't snow. We got that going for us,
Which is nice.
which is always nice. Uh, but yeah, they say about New Mexico, if you don't like the weather, just wait 5 minutes.
Yeah.
I was out this morning. It was sunny, and I, watered all the trees and the bushes and things. And but yeah, it's taken a rather ugly turn now. So, but if it's got some moisture with it, I can't complain. So,
Yeah. Cool. So So this has come up a few times lately, and I was kind of kicking myself that I didn't ask Jeff more about it. We've talked about it some, but not as a standalone, not as the headline. And I thought maybe as the headline, it might generate some interesting musings. And that is, I want to propose that there are, let's say, two schools of thought on what the self is, and and then there's every variation in between. So I'm guessing that the two fundamental schools are there's something there, and the other is there's nothing there. And what I mean by that is, and so I'm wondering if the is nothing there, is that purely mechanistic, or are there other ways to end up at that conclusion? And with there's something there, is that ultimately spiritual or post rational, where you sort of have to believe in um, a soul or a spirit or a uh, essence in order to figure out what's at the bottom of that well. And so and I guess the rest of my question is: are there other versions of this that you know of? So, like, what is the self, and what are the various takes on that?
um, well, I think that the where I go immediately is to this idea that all meaning is context based. So, what the self is seems to me to depend on where you're tuning the perceptive apparatus. The other main thing that I think of is which direction do we head off into to answer that question? Do I head off to the outside world, or do I turn back and head to the inside world?
So let's blow up both of those. So
Mhm.
the all context is, I'm sorry, all meaning is context based. Um, so that proposes that the self, it only exists as a construct of meaning. That if meaning didn't exist, the self wouldn't exist either, and that's why we're kind of framing the question as all meaning is context based, and so how are we looking at the self through that lens, right?
Yeah, and that there may be levels and layers to the phenomenon of self. And connected with with Jeff, it was when he was and you referred to his using of the term being, and that's usually where philosophers start to try to unravel that.
Hmm.
And so for Heidegger, this term being, he didn't take it stock, he modified it, right? instead of using the traditional German word for being, which is sein, Sein, he had this idea called Dasein, the Dasein, with da in front of there.
The,
And da, yeah.
which means the, right?
Well, it's in this case, the implication of it is that it isn't just being in a generalized way, but that it is a particularized being, a being that has a here and a now. And so that it sometimes it gets described as being there, or being in a particular place in a particular time. Sounds familiar. uh, and and then for him, this idea of being it's connected with time or temporality, because when we try to explore that, time becomes the duration, and which implies a thing that's being that's enduring through the duration, and so time ends up showing up like an aspect of being, if that makes sense.
I,
So,
I actually don't quite get it. I don't know if it's worth trying to explain it in a different way, but
well, the only way that we know that we experience or can attach to this idea of time, be it a priori as an intuition or being through experience here and now, is through things that are. And it seems that we only can start to be aware of time when things start to be, and then when they stop being, is that idea of duration across a dimension of time.
got it. Got
So
it.
if there's nothing we're meant, if I'm measuring the table, I can measure it in 3 dimensions. But when there's no table, there's no measuring.
Hmm.
And so if time is just this idea of measuring, our experience of it is that it is a finite measuring. There's the beginning and there's the end. And so, in terms of being, and therefore in terms of the self, time is sort of intimately connected with it. As we have pointed out before, because we have chapters, we transit through time, our particular being. Whether we try to answer that from the outside or from the inside, that seems to be the case. So that's what might push this idea of time into an a priori, a precondition. And it doesn't mean, as Jeff said, that someone thought of it first. It means it was first, in this case, ontologically a priori. Yeah. So, so that is both subjective and objective. And maybe that's a clue about the dimensionality of time, uh, is that it seems to transcend that distinction. Right. So, because I mean, there is. I think that the safest place that we have to try to understand self, as other philosophers have come to conclude, is from the experience of self, and that's kind of where we end up with phenomenology, which is a way of asking what is the self experience. And then we push that further into existentialism, which is kind of like there's nothing but the self. And the self sort of becomes the source of everything. What isn't self somehow? Um, and, I think that what we've seen before with philosophies is that we tend to come up with a model of things and we push it to the extreme until it breaks, till it seems like, okay, it doesn't work. And then someone else comes along and says, okay, we have to upgrade that. And I think that that is probably related to the journey of the knowing of the self. Um, and, uh, you know, and let's see, I'm trying to think of who talks about this. I guess it is Heidegger again, where he says, only only a self, only a being in this condition of Dasein would be concerned about this question of what is the self, of what is being, of what it is to be. So that's something we're getting close to that consciousness, conscious of consciousness, or consciousness, conscious of the situation of consciousness. Um, and of course the self is all tied up with the very mystery of subjective objective. With no self, there's no subjective, there's no objective. So it is a das sign. It is from a place, because that place is what determines everything else, that generates the context that meaning happens inside of. So I guess the argument could be made that this particular is the only way that being can actually manifest, is in particularity. And we can't generally be without losing grasp of things.
So I wonder if you could explain more what the being is that transcendental meditation focuses on. You just talked about it relative to time, but is what TM refers to as being just an experience of the self, and is there anything unique about that experience of the self?
I'm definitely not an expert in TM. And I don't know where their path really leads. I think that my experience comes more from having sat in the Zen center for a while, and then as an ayahuasquero, and as a human over decades. And there's a lot of ways that, there's the general question, what is the self? And the specific, what is this self? And that's part of that process of at least investigating the nail, investigating that particularity. Why me this way? Sort of. Which the Advaita Vedanta teacher, Ramana Maharishi, says enlightenment lies in if you just ask yourself the question, who am I? If you take it like that Zen idea of like swallowing hot metal that you can't swallow down and you can't spit up, right? That you have to take that question upon yourself as if your hair is on fire, as the Zen masters would say. Uh, but I think this is one of the things that, do we answer these questions, or are we just qualifying experience by the asking of them and the methodology that we go through in order to ask them? Because there's different ways that we move in mind. We move in mind in one way in daylight, in another way in dream, and the sense of self seems to stay with us. We move from dream into psychedelic realities, and the idea of self, in spite of whatever scouring it might take in these processes, all three of them, that idea of the self seems to remain. And we end up at the onion peelings, right? We take away a level or layer, we take away another layer, we take another layer, but the core of that is the experiencing of existence, the witnessing of that experience. And so, Descartes' argument was that's the only thing that we know is. And and I guess yes, but at the same time, it makes sense to accept some of these givens of the dream. I'm going to take for now that I'm not a butterfly. I'm just going to, as a working theory, and that my senses are feeding me back something that's not entirely irrelevant. Right. And that's where Jeff said, you don't want to dance around with these questions too long because of temporality, because the clock is ticking. and I agree with that in that American pragmatic sort of a way. Those questions will come upon you, the bigger non-pragmatic aspects of it will come upon you in chapters of the journey. Um, but I think there is something to trusting your experience as a human, and that it is, this idea that every life is a koan, that there is something that the universe was thinking when it you'd you, and that is the mystery of Dasein, that of this particular existence.
So
And
even if we're living in the matrix, it's best to continue living as though the reality that we experience day to day is real enough.
I think in a pragmatic way, when we're talking about it in the Cartesian meditation sense, I think you can trust that the table is there in front of you. I don't think the Zen master will argue with you that the table is front of you. In fact, if he thinks you're starting to doubt that, he may hit you. Which fair game, right? Fair enough.
Fair play. Yep.
We call that pointing to, right? The finger pointing to the moon. And so, but which doesn't mean that cultural artifacts shouldn't be explored, and that ideas of identity through association to post-birth phenomena shouldn't be unfolded.
So I'm still a little torn about whether the whether a sense of being that refers to a fundamental enough self is something that exists outside of the rational worldview or outside of the secular worldview as a result, because it's not something that you can prove exists. Like you can
No
prove
self, no view.
what's that?
No self, no view.
Well, except the self that I think we refer to is not the ego, and it's not the superego, and it's not the id, right? It's
The
uh
seat of experience.
well, it's the seat of experience. It's potentially the unit in which entelechy resides, right? The acorn
I would presume.
expressing itself.
Yeah.
And so that's a
Or that may be its first layer.
okay, yeah. And maybe on the inside it's stardust or
Or
whatever.
maybe that's where sign without the da exists.
Uh
And then as soon as we start moving down into particularity, it starts to accumulate layers of isness
yeah.
in a lower, slower dimensional state.
But my question is, how could that, like, how do you reconcile, not you, how does one reconcile a secular worldview and a experience of the self or a belief in the self? Do you have to just limit how deep down the rabbit hole you go and say it's that's that's as far as we can prove, but it's far enough to say that a self exists?
I think that the image that I have is of a pearl diver, and the more experience you have and the better your apparatus, the deeper you can dive. And, I don't know whether it's true, but I'm gonna say the better pearls you're gonna pull out. Bend the analogy if I must. Uh, and that, but that you just have to remember when you come to the surface, everything is controlled folly. That's from Don Juan's idea that yes, you do live in the world that we see, the world of bathrooms and restaurants, as my Zen master would say, because those don't exist in the world of God, using his map. Uh, but that's where that idea of controlled folly is. And that's why I said it depends on the self and where you dial. And so if you keep in the back of your mind that when you dial it all the way in one direction, you end up with creator energy undifferentiated. And if you dial it all the way down, you dial it into the very particularity, right? And this is again the joke of the general at the expense of the particular. Uh, and that the human capacity is to be able to share both, have a foot in both of those realms, dangling between the beasts and the gods. And so so the self shows up differently when you're tuned to the field differently. And that the self maybe in its partness is a part of this greater field of creation. And so it depends on the level of creation that your apparatus is dialed in on, what level of self shows up, whether it's a material self you can bonk into, or a psychological self, or a spiritual self, or a all the way no longer filtered or defined by lower dimensions and all God all the time. Neem Karoli style, if you will, with that theory. Yeah. And I think that we only come to conclusions about those conclusions arrived at otherwise than through experience are speculation that's of very little value. And so when we start to talk about those things and the experiencing of the self in that pearl diver, like one doesn't just dive for pearls. Presumably, there's a technology involved. There's other more experienced people that tell you where the best pearls are found and what the dangers are, like those big clams. Don't stick your leg in those, right? We've all seen those movies, right? so, so, uh, uh, so the idea is that, yeah, you don't swim deeper than you can hold your breath, but that the self will still be there, some aspect of it. There's still a thread to follow.
I was going to go in a different direction, but that's the second time I've thought of how people might understand the common psychedelic experience of ego death as it relates to proof of self or loss of self. Because I've heard people describe it as the loss of all defense mechanisms and the experience of an inner essence. And I've heard other people describe it as a loss of any of the boundaries between self and other and emerging with the
Hmm.
rest of the universe and the rest of consciousness. Those seem like different experiences, but I've heard them both called ego death. What and you mentioned earlier that and with the pearl diving example also that there's there are, say, levels of selfness that one can experience. And I think you're also saying there's not an experience that's beyond self because it's self having the experience.
Pretty much.
So
Pretty
what do you
much.
think about ego death or the merging people experience? Is that symbolic?
Yeah, I mean, it's always hard to tell what experiences other people are having and how they're languaging them.
Well,
And
I'm thinking of Mr. Universe Land for one. Our
right.
friend. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, it depends on, this is why I guess I like that idea of Jacob's ladder that we might have spoken of before. That I told you about this unusual person that I met, and he had gone through this psycho-mathematical process to the periodic chart of the elements and tried to carry it up into mind. He called them the mind matter integration equations. This idea that there is a continuity, but there is that, and Jeff mentioned this, as if he said, you'll fall into dualism, as if there was and this is maybe this is related to the question of a self, is to what degree does the distinction mind and matter exist, and how much of it is a mental one? And is it you know, is does the viewpoint create it or does the viewpoint just experience it? And we can find people that argue both ways, maybe with the existentialists at one end and the Platonists and the Neoplatonists relying on the mysteries at the other end, and perhaps the shaman. Uh, because I guess, and this is something that I've always sort of thought, is that rational thinking only works within the daylight dimensions. And you know, that's why Finnegan's Wake is significant because and difficult because it's written in dream think. And the hallucinogenic experience shares elements of both. One maintains a certain amount of consciousness, but one certainly doesn't have the kind of control that one has during daylight waking consciousness. And it has got a lot of images and a lot of unconscious material that spills out. And the inherent difficulties of the ego to integrate that material or even to face it, just to swim in those waters, is related to the difficulty that the self experiences in the psychedelic dimensions. This is all my, you know, theory. I'm not. There's nobody to quote about this stuff really. Maybe Terence McKenna has some ideas, but you know, the experience that different people have is going to be related to where they are on that tuning. You know, which radio station they're. You know, and there's different taxonomies to ways. You know, Reich had one that was based on human development. And so he had the human development moving through an ocular stage and an oral stage and an anal stage and a genital stage. And, you know, Tim Leary had a theory. I'll try to dig out which book it was in, where he had like 24 circuits. And as far as his reading of things, you know, culture had made it up to a certain level in the 20s, and that you are going to be stretching beyond where culture would bring you to get into those higher circuits, he called them. There's definitely certain, you know, every one of these models is built around certain observations and realizations. So they all kind of have a vision that they communicate, and they all have shortcomings, like all metaphors do. Um, but but so there is this idea that based on where we're tuning, that's going to have to do with what our experience is. And like, for example, I've seen people that had spiritual experiences that, from my perspective, were very clearly social experiences that were related
Can you
to
give an
being
example?
accepted. Well, relating to being accepted by a group after a lifetime of feeling insecure and feeling unaccepted, feeling on the outside. And then all of a sudden there's a group there, and the group reinforces identity in a certain way. And then certain psychological experiences will lend themselves to be interpreted in a way to reinforce that. This is basically how cults work. And then it takes further experience to relativize that experience within the big picture to realize that you just took a wooden nickel. Right. But this is a very difficult conversation to be able to get into, because where does one human being stand to judge another person's so-called spiritual experience? It's, you know, unless you accept somebody as a master or a teacher, say, okay, I'm at least gonna give them a lesson. You know, everybody's just he said, she said, right? So that, you know, and that's why certain traditions, particularly like within Buddhist traditions, there's these ideas that you prove your levels of realization. How many sheets can you dry? Well, that's how good your yoga is, right? uh there, you know, so there are this idea that levels can be tested. But now in in the scientific world, we're talking about a whole dimension that is not really scientifically accessible. We rely a lot on self-reporting for mental states.
It kind of brings us back to something you said earlier. There were two main thoughts you had about self, and one was about all meaning being context based, and we unpacked that some. And the other
Mhm.
was about the it depends on if you're coming at it from an internal or an external perspective. And then later you also mentioned the mystery of the subjective. So now I think we're at that point again where, who can judge anybody else's spiritual experience? Fair enough. How
Mhm.
does that tie back to our understanding of self and these ideas of internal and external views on it and the mystery of the subjective?
Yeah. Well, um, how to say something useful about this? We understand ourselves. There's this idea that's pretty old, maybe Hegelian, that for our consciousness to form as a consciousness, we need this encounter with the other. And I think I mentioned this in the episode after the one with Jeff, where I was saying, isn't it curious that the word other is in there with mother, as that consciousness that is reflective in a way that generates this conception of self by something outside pointing at you. And this is why we have this mystery of feral children, right? What is it like if it's just if you're Romulus and Remus raised by wolves and there's no linguistic referential uh there does this how does a self form up and the
Oh, that's interesting. You're bringing it back to the semantic world being a kind of table stakes for consciousness, and therefore for a self to exist it has to exist in the world of linguistics.
well, we use the word subject and we use the word object.
Yeah,
So yeah,
and if there's something essential about the self, I could also see that being pre-linguistic, right? Romulus and Remus having souls. If we all have souls, there's no reason to think they wouldn't also.
right, right. Well, and that comes up to the question of the very linguisticality of reality, and this mystery that it isn't a. The mystery is that there is a duality and it is a unity, that it goes down as well as goes up, right? I don't think that what's going on here really can easily be answered by either up or down models, because there's clearly an interpenetration of up with down and down with up.
You better explain that. I think we touched on it before, but I don't.
Well,
Somebody just listening to this might not know what
right.
you mean by up and down models.
Well, I'm thinking of the staircase, and that was in our conversation with Jeff, but we've also talked about it before with Finnegan, and the idea that did we fall from spirit into matter, or did we accumulate out of matter until spirit arose as an epiphenomenon of some sort? Or did it emerge? Or was it imminent? And then that's where we get all these different flavors of metaphysical schools, the epiphenomenalists and the uh, um, the emergence varieties, hard emergence, or strong emergence, and weak emergence, and or just the pure materialistic. Which I guess would be a version of the weaker emergence arguments. That, of course, higher things of course, a beehive can do things an individual bee can't do, but that doesn't mean that anything mystical is going on other than a lot of bees, and that it's sort of like there isn't really anything emerging except multiplication of facilities, and that sort of falls
Except
out of the math.
except for what emerges via natural selection and sexual selection.
Right, right, and that the stuff that you would expect, but this idea of all of a sudden mind emerges out of stuff. And that's where, so you have the materialist oriented view that starts at the bottom of the ladder or toward the lower end, somewhere closer to the turtles. And then they start up and they end up with either either secular theory or a theological end. Maybe there doesn't I guess if you start from the bottom, you don't need to end up anywhere other than theory. But the top downers, they have to start with mind. And their argument is that mind trickles down through those different steps until it's manifest as the most basic thoughts, if you will, of the universe. And the people that build up from the bottom, their argument is that, deity is this huge assumption. It's like this big, you're assuming this whole miraculous thing that just, squatted this out. But if you listen to the materialists build their steps up, it has those 3 leaps in there.
I think we named 4 when we included the Big Bang, maybe. Um,
If you wanna put the bang in there.
that's kind of a big one.
Although, it's getting a lot of grief nowadays. I don't know how long the Big Bang will be with us.
Yeah, and fair enough. I mean,
Yeah, yeah,
it, so
yeah. But there are those leaps, and there's this idea that we say, "Yeah, something," they get termed miraculous, but somehow that's okay. Somehow that's not a hitch in the theory.
because you can explain it logically enough, even if you can't. Um,
Well, I don't know that you can explain it logically.
well, I'm thinking of the heat vents and like how life began, and the best explanation to date, I assume, for how all the
Right,
elements were in the right place.
right.
It doesn't explain life being fundamentally a different order of existence than pre-life.
Right, it doesn't handle that. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And there's this idea that I must admit I share, being a plumber and a shade tree mechanic, and that is, like, what I was thinking about this the other day, is, whenever I need to turn a really big machine, I run a generator instead of take it off of the solar system. So every once in a while, I have to run this generator, and after a while, if the generator lasts, inevitably, especially in the wintertime when it gets cold, there is an inevitability that the rope on the pull start will break. Well, so now usually it's cold when this happens too. So now you got to take this thing off. You got to take it into the shop. You got to take it apart. That's easy, right? In fact, sometimes it's too easy because there's a spring in there. And there's a whole number of phenomenon that when you're taking things apart, it goes spring and it comes apart in a way that might be a little mysterious about how we put it all back together. And so when I first started wrestling with this, I knew how the pieces related to one another, kind of positionally, but I didn't completely understand their states. And so, how to charge that spring up so that when you pull the rope pulls back in, turned out to be a little tricky. So, it turns out that you can take something apart and think that you understand how it works because you understand some of the relationships of the
I
pieces.
think Wilbur talks about this, but with smashing a camera, right?
Right. But
Yeah.
until you can put that thing together again and it works like it did in the beginning, you don't understand it. You may claim, you may write a philosophical promissory note that says that, oh, this is something we'll bullshit, bullshit. If you knew it, you could do it both ways. If you don't know it, then anybody can take it apart, right? That's how kids start learning how things work. They take things apart. They rarely get them back together again, you may notice.
Mhm.
Right. So anyway, the point here is you can say you understand how a cell works. Well, okay, then build me one. When you build me one, then we'll talk about your theory about how everything else works. But until then, this is all just philosophical promissory notes. So, okay, we've taken away a creator, we've taken away mind as the source trickling down, but we've had to swallow four miraculous kind of things in the midst there. So we've taken away one big and we've replaced it with four slightly smaller, I don't know.
Oh, and probably for the folks just joining us, we should name those four leaps. So
Oh, okay,
one
good
was the
point.
Big Bang, one was the emergence of life, one was the emergence of consciousness, and the last was the emergence of consciousness aware of consciousness,
Right. Self-awareness.
self-aware.
Yeah. Yeah. In that those that's referred to historically as the great chain of being. And traditionally, as we pointed out with Jeff's infinite staircase, traditionally comes from the top down, creator manifesting from more complexity down through lesser complexity. Uh, and then the more now, since the scientific revolution, people have been striving to build that model up from the bottom. And they have not yet successfully found a way to prove their way across those four leaps. The first being existence, the second being life, the third being awareness, life that's conscious. And the idea is the arguments are, well, if you accumulate enough dead stuff, you'll get an alive stuff if you put it together cleverly. And if you get enough alive stuff, you'll go through this process of getting more efficient. And so you find yourself in this curiously philosophical yoga position where you have to start explaining that higher functions exist for the purpose of lower functions.
In order to make them more efficient, you mean?
Right. So now I'm going to understand and I'm going to generate philosophy and an understanding of beauty and a question about the cosmos so that I can get fed better.
Hmm.
Is basically the argument, right?
Reproduce more effectively.
So that I can reproduce more
Is that
effectively.
not
Yeah.
true?
I don't think it's true. No.
No.
I think that the experience of higher consciousness, the genuine experience of higher consciousness says this is what it's all about. This is why, this is where you're supposed to wake up at the wake. That's the, and that I believe that people came to that conclusion originally through mystical experience, not through thinking and
Yeah.
reason.
Yeah.
And that's not translatable, so they didn't leave it in language because it's beyond language. Those traditions were interrupted, and now we're trying to piece that together through the language arguments. And if you read Plato, he retreats into myth, and to the mysteries. He says, well, these are the mysteries. And then you get into the Neoplatonists like Plotinus, and they have actual practices that were more, we would probably expect them more in a Buddhist monastery setting than we would in a Western philosophical setting.
You
So
just said something about these experiences were not codified in language. You didn't use the word codified because they exist beyond language. And I keep getting tripped up on that in terms of all meaning, all consciousness, the universe itself potentially being linguistic in nature. I think you said
sure,
earlier. And
sure.
then
Well,
things,
let me qualify that.
yeah.
It's not the reason that you and I can talk about a car is because we have cars in common experience. As soon as we start having experiences that aren't common, then people who didn't have that experience can't share that meaning, right? So if we have a mystical tradition and we have names for things, we got to those names because I brought you there and I said, see that? That's a one of those. And that is a one of those. And as soon as we don't have that thing to refer to, then we're off building pictures with words that are open to more loose interpretation than pointing to it and saying that, right? If I if I tell a person who has no real experience in ceremonies about daimonios, this becomes a package for their lack of experience, right? So everything that they might imagine goes into that box, and everything from movies they might have seen or tales they might, or whatever their
There's a whole
imagination can.
hermeneutic first page there, yeah. Like every
Exactly.
time I imagine like when I'm visiting somebody's house for the first time, I form a picture of what the house looks like. I assume everyone does this.
Uh-huh.
And with each day between the invitation and the visit, like I imagine myself in the house, I imagine having a conversation in the house, eating a meal in the house, and then I get there and everything's completely different usually than what I expected. Every now and then there's a surprising coincidence,
Uh-huh.
but yeah, that is a hermeneutic process.
And it's a problem of language in that we use languages or we use words in different ways, and we don't map out the differences that exist
Again,
there.
it's the general and the particular.
Exactly. And so what happens is we stop using the words of those experiences become labels for ineffables, handles for the ineffable, instead of descriptions in a natural philosophy sort of a way. This leaf has 3 lobes, and it's rough on the bottom, and it's serrated on the edges, and they get bigger as they go up the plant. That's a sort of a descriptive. These are just labels because there's not a lot we can say about them. Or if you look at the traditions that do try to say things about them, it sounds ridiculous really fast. And it just becomes a string of adjectives that tell you that the human apparatus was just all the needles were pinned and there was no, it was the psychic equivalent of the standing wave syndrome for the garage band. Right? It's just overloaded. Everything's red zoned, and who knows what went on there, right? Because we just don't have a map for that. And but people with shamanic experience collectively or through a maestro apprentice relationship, the map you can learn a map and build a map out into those territories, but these are not places that many people can go. And if you try to, you can't have a conversation about it because there's no common base for experience. So that's what I mean to say that language won't go there. Common language hasn't mapped that yet, is a more accurate way to say
Yeah,
it.
yeah.
Yeah.
Got it.
Yeah. I think that when you get there, language might become the only thing that you have because you've got all these images, and so the maps are built of like being able to identify and to some degree taxonomize the images.
A word is worth a thousand pictures.
In this case, maybe
Yeah.
if
It
if
reminds
it
me of there are some like archetypal things that get called in ceremony. So for example, the the lake of forgetfulness, or the of forgetting, right? Which is a place where you go float in the water in this lake, or maybe take a dip in it, and you forget all of the trauma that you might have experienced and get a fresh start. um, and that's a place that doesn't exist on earth. I mean, you could have that experience on earth, but it's a place that exists in the collective psyche that you can refer to and call in and introduce people to and talk about it,
Mhm.
amongst people that have experienced it. And
Right,
that phrase, the lake of forgetting, means there's a Venn diagram in which there's a lot of things that people that have had that experience will share about it, and then there are plenty of things that each person will experience individually about it.
right, right.
And I wonder if the latter points to the self in a interesting way. Um,
Sure.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Well, or in the way of a Kurosawa movie, right? Is it Rashomon, where it's, uh, uh, one occurrence, one event that's told from 5 different viewpoints, and it's a different experience in 5 different ways, yeah. And what is that difference? I guess it would be the self because it has that viewpoint. It's from there. From this side, it was blue. From the other side, maybe it was red, but this was being here. And that's what this experience was. Yeah. And that question of how does one relativize it and when what's the how universalize it? Like uh why were you chosen for the experience of life that you have had in all the dimensions that you didn't input? This is a great question that many orphans ponder,
Mhm.
but I think other people do also. And that is, why does my experience look the way that it looks?
It's a more sophisticated version of it's not fair. I didn't ask to be born.
Right. Except that is less dimensional. And this is like spherically dimensional. Like you can literally ask that on with any elements, from why was I lucky enough to be born with legs to why was I unlucky enough to be born with X, Y, or Z, or why this room in this house on this street on this, and that's a version of the idea that every life is a koan, every life is a riddle, and that riddle is maybe the same as the self and the fortune cookie or the fortune inside the fortune cookie of the self. It's a mixing of metaphors.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that the you know, the fortune cookie might just be a construct and the fortune inside of it might be more real. Because you can kind of get to when you talk about being or you try to bridge the need for self in a secular way,
Mhm.
meaning explain self-awareness in a secular way.
By
You
taking by folding up the outside all around the inside,
right, right. Yeah.
where the meaning is coiled up inside of all this matter. Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting idea there.
Inside all the explanation. Yeah.
All the sugar and the
Huh.
starch.
Yeah. Was there more about the internal view and external view, or do you feel like we handled
Well, I
that?
think that where that model comes from is from that section, when we spoke about the I Ching, and the sages were trying to understand the nature of reality. They went all the way on the outside and they went all the way on the inside. And there is implied a grokking, a deep, intuitive, in the bones understanding of the interrelationship between the inside and the outside, or of the subjective objective relationship, or of the apparent duality, or of the Tao and its the the two that are really one, but that show up as two, so we give them different names. That idea, and that is, I think, the same mystery as the self, right? Because the self is just the inside version of that, the matter mind meeting place. Are you more mind than matter or more matter than mind?
So hold on. I think that's a metaphysical position that you're taking.
It's a couple of them.
Yeah. Yeah.
A couple options, I mean.
Yeah. And I can relate to, and I think it's also poetically appropriate for the mystery of the Tao writ large, right? The mystery of everything to be reflected in the mystery of the very individual. Um,
Microcosm, macrocosm.
yeah, I mean that has a balance to it that makes it attractive. But can we explain it at all?
Well, I was quoting Lao Tzu's first chapter in the Tao Te Ching, and this idea of viewing life with passion to see one side of it, and without passion to see the source of it. And then he goes on and says these two seem like they're two different things, but they're not.
Hmm.
Uh, uh, then this gets referred to in the Tao Te Ching a bunch of different way as the mother and its children. You know, so the mother is Tao, and the children is everything that we see and bang into, right? Or, uh, um, he talks about loving to draw sustenance from the mother and the images of a nursing child, but he's talking about his psycho-spiritual relationship with the cause of reality manifesting in the sweetness of the wrapping, if you will. Uh, so, it's like know the cookie, but keep to the fortune.
Yeah, yeah. Um, and I guess the Western Christian version of that is something like God is everywhere and in everything, and it just doesn't get explained very well, and so people are like, "Is he watching me now?" Right? And then they end up not believing in a God that couldn't possibly be watching everybody all the time, right?
Right,
Like
right.
there's a
Or
there's a
yeah,
secularization of it, or an objectifying of it.
right. Well, and I think that it's a carrying, and maybe it started with Aquinas, where he wanted to Aristotelianize and rationalize the mysteries of faith. And then it's fitting that in his life he had an experience that said that all of his writings were chaff, right? But there's this fundamental mystery which shows up in Christianity as the Trinity, right? Which is God the Father, creator of all, source of everything, cosmic source, as in Tao, the manifestation in the Son, interpreted not Jesus as as separate from other humans, merely as realized, if you will, by way of that macrocosm, microcosm meeting of mind and matter, large scale, small scale, unified scale. And then this Holy Spirit, unseen, but that moves through the world and connects it all. And all these things are God, right? So so you can't blame folks for getting confused. And then the natural instinct is to try uh, to figure it out. So one of my favorite Neem Karoli quotes is, uh, "It's better to love everyone than to try to figure it out." I think that's what it is. And he said things like, "Love everyone, serve everyone, remember God." He had a definite quote about it's better to see God in everything than to try to figure it out. I
Mm,
think that's what it
mhm.
was. And so again, this is not a conceptual teaching. This is a how to drive your brain teaching. This is not what to think with your mental cogitation process. This is move out of that mental cogitation process, see things with new eyes, wake up to find out today's rock and roll reference, wake up to find out that you are the eyes of the world, right? Grateful Dead. Uh, so this idea that it's a shifting of consciousness, not a thinking of different thoughts within the same mode of consciousness, I guess, is to try to clarify that.
Yeah.
And it's so easy for the cogitating mind, the left brain driven mind, to take things into itself and piecify it So any instructions about how to move out of that mind get sort of absorbed by it and conceptualized with it, and then it runs a simulation, but it's all within that same cogitating mind instead of actually moving out. That's why the Zen master hits you. Pow! Because he wants to put you back in the whole picture, not off in that left brain wheel turning thing. This is about isness, not about thinking about isness.
Mhm.
I like that. And so, I mean, I'm one of these people that, and this is a metaphysical assumption that partially based on experience, and that is that the nature of spiritual experience is so ineffable that when we come and we try to use metaphors to explain it, we inevitably fail, and our metaphors inevitably are misunderstood because you can't understand that with that mind. You have to experience it with this whole mind. So any picture that the half of the brain comes up with of it isn't it. Right? That's why the Tao which can be spoken can't be spoken, because it needs to move past that place. So,
So here's
yeah,
here's a question. I think I know how you'll answer this. We've talked before about the continual emergence of matter from probability. Like there's all the things that could possibly happen, and in the next moment there is what is happening, and that's a continuous unfolding. Microcosm, macrocosm. That the case also with the self? So there's not a fixed essence to the self, like or the nature of the soul is not deterministic. It's always emergent.
and
I might be
and
getting too esoteric,
I th-
but
I think the way that the Buddhists typically refer to this is with the idea of dependent originations. That all particularities, including Dasein, right, the human, that all these particularities arise because of causes and conditions, and that the duration ceases when the causes and conditions necessary for its existence pass away. So, and that's this idea of interdependent originations or dependent originations, that everything, all these causes, it's a soup of causes and a soup of conditions. And we emerge out of that soup of causes and conditions. And as those causes and conditions subside, we also will subside, which is just a fancy way of saying we're generated by a field. If you want to get all physicist about it, we're qualities or characteristics of a field, and when the field changes, it may no longer have those qualities or characteristics.
yeah, yeah. I guess a religious view of the self might put the self outside of that, and ascribe some universal, timeless. That's what I think of with soul, is that it like the model that each soul is a fragment of the total consciousness, and
Sure.
consciousness exists. If the universe is a place out of which you cannot fall, the conditions for consciousness can never be undone.
No, but the definitions might change. That is, the degree of your personalness may be altered,
That's fair.
and because there might only be one identity in the universe. He said self-reflexively.
With a wink. Cool.
Aham brahmasmi is what they say, right? Aham brahmasmi. I am Brahma.
Uh-huh.
I am God, right? But meaning the whole shebang,
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
Cool. Well, maybe let's pause there. That we got a little out there, but hopefully we brought it all back together enough for folks. So I'm hoping we get some good feedback.
Sounds good.
Thank you,
See
Brian.
everybody next time.
Take care.
Bye bye.